of our favourite speakers about food. First person you're going to hear from is Professor David Guest, and he is a professor at Sydney University in the Faculty of Agriculture and Environment. And then the second person, who has now become a good friend of David's through their talks together, is Galit Segev, and she is many things. She's a scientist, she's a chef, she does school holiday programs here for us around food, she cooks. She is just a woman of many talents, and the things that you've just been tasting now are all her creations.
So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a little bit about some of the work that I do with cocoa farmers, and I'm going to talk to you about where does cocoa come from. I'm also going to hopefully not frighten you too much, but some of you may have seen news stories about the world running out of chocolate, or about chocolate prices increasing, about to increase. And so I'll talk to you about some of the issues behind that, and why we may be entering a period of peak chocolate. It may be that we've got about as much chocolate as we'll ever have, and why should we be worried about that? So as Vanessa said, I'm a professor at the university. I'm a professor of plant pathology, and so I work on plant diseases and the way that plants defend themselves against disease. And that's how I got into working with cocoa, because as you'll see, pests and diseases causes about 40% loss in cocoa yields. And so I became interested in how I could help cocoa farmers to improve their yields, which ultimately improves the supply of chocolate for us. And I'm also part of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, which specialises in looking at problems in Southeast, or looking at issues in Southeast Asia, and how Australians and Southeast Asians can work together in solving those problems. So a lot of the work that I do is in Southeast Asia. Now, I think, oh no, that's right, I've got to go down here, don't I? Okay, so where does chocolate come from? Well, chocolate comes from a tree. Okay, so we get rid of that. So, and I'll show you a little bit about the tree in a moment, but the tree bears pods. And inside these pods there are cocoa beans, and those cocoa beans are what we process and get chocolate from. The tree itself originates in two parts of South America, one in the upper Amazon, around what's Ecuador, Colombia and Ecuador, and also in the Orinoco, which is around the border between Venezuela and Colombia. So there's two parts, two quite separate origins of cocoa. And the fine flavour cocoa, the ones that have the really good flavour, tend to come from the Orinoco. The upper Amazon cocos are more robust. They don't have quite the same fine flavours. What happened was that around about 1,000 years ago, the Mayans, who lived in what's now Mexico, started importing cocoa beans from the Orinoco. And at that time, they were incredibly valuable products. So a cocoa bean, and you see here's some cocoa beans here. So cocoa beans were actually used as a currency. You could buy a chicken for, I think, 4 cocoa beans. You could buy a goat for 20. Apparently you could buy a woman for about 10. But anyway, that's what they say. So the Mayans collected this cocoa, and it was called criollo. And criollo means wild or forest cocoa. All right, so they collected this cocoa, they took it up and cultivated it in Mexico, and it was really something that the priests and the royalty had access to. It wasn't something that the general public had a lot of access to. And I think Galit's going to talk to you a little bit about what they used to do with cocoa, because they didn't actually make chocolate. They made other forms. Usually they drank a form of cocoa. So, the next one. So they called it Coco Atol, something like that. It was made from roasted cocoa beans, and it was a prized drink of the elite Mayan society. Now, when the Spaniards went to South America, they saw that this was something that the elite people in Mexico were drinking, And so they took it back to, Cortez took it back to Spain. And it was introduced as one of those New World curiosities. And from Spain it then spread across Europe, largely by royal marriages, because again it was restricted to very wealthy people. It was an exotic, highly prized commodity. So as princes and princesses married each other around Europe, the habit of drinking chocolate spread around Europe. The tree itself is a small tree. It grows up to about 5 metres in the rainforest, but in commercial plantations, farmers keep it to about 2.5 or 3 metres by pruning. And that's simply so that it's easy to pick the pods. If the tree gets too high, it's hard to carry a ladder around. So they tend to prune the trees to about 2.5 metres. It's a perennial tree and it lives in the rainforest under the tall trees. So that means it's actually quite difficult to find in nature. And there's only been a few expeditions around the Amazon and Orinoco looking for the origins of, or the sort of original wild cocoa. But from those collections, from those expeditions, people have set up collections in places like Trinidad, and they're used to breed the commercial cocoa that we grow around the world. As you'll see, most of the world's cocoa comes from West Africa now, so it's been taken from South America and grown in West Africa. What happens is that as a rainforest tree, it flushes. So what that means is that during the different seasons, the wet and the dry season, you get a flush of flowers. Those flowers take about 6 months to develop pods, and then you get a flush of leaves, right? And so they alternate between the plant puts its energy into producing flowers, and then it puts its energy into producing leaves. The pods develop over 5 to 6 months, and the trees generally bear somewhere between 20 and 50 pods a year. Now, and that's something that's very, very subject to management. If you're a good farmer, you'll be able to get at least 60 pods per tree, 100 pods, 150 pods. If you're not such a good farmer, or you're not paying so much attention to your cocoa, you might be lucky to get 10 or 20 pods. And I want you to remember that, because when I come back to talking about why we might be facing a chocolate crisis, one of the answers is not to grow more cocoa, but to improve the way we manage the existing cocoa, so that we move the yields up from 20 pods a tree up to 50 or 60 pods a tree. And you can see that simply by doing that, we'll be able to triple production. But there's reasons why that's difficult for farmers, which I'll talk about. So each of these pods, and you can see what I mean, these are pods that are collected from different trees, and you can see the diversity. So if you go into the rainforest where cocoa originates, you'll see all sorts of shapes and sizes of pods. There's actually about 20 species of cocoa. There's only 2 that we grow commercially. So there's even a lot more variation than this from non-commercial cocoa. So these are wild trees that we currently don't utilise in plantations. So each of these pods contains 30 to 50 seeds. It's covered in a really sweet mucilage. It's lovely. As Galit saw last year when we were in Sulawesi, they're actually really nice and refreshing just to suck on a seed because of the mucilage. Tastes nothing like chocolate. It's just a really sweet, refreshing pulp. So it doesn't taste like chocolate. I'll explain why. So each pod basically contains enough chocolate for a 100-gram chocolate bar. Right, so if your tree is producing 50 cocoa pods, that's equivalent to about 50 chocolate bars on a tree. So how do we get it to taste like chocolate? So when you open the pod, you can see the seeds inside this sweet white mucilage. It's really lovely. But that mucilage is rich in sugar. So if you put them into a bin, you scoop the seeds out, you put them into a bin that's about a cubic metre, and over 4 or 5 days it'll ferment. And that fermentation generates heat. That heat gets rid of any nasty germs that are there, but it also, during that fermentation, it also develops a chocolate flavour. right? So it's the fermentation process that actually turns these beans into something that tastes like chocolate. So after 4 to 6 days, they're fermented, and then they're put out. The best cocoa is sun-dried, but you can also artificially dry it. So it's put out into the sun. The moisture content's reduced to about 10%, and they're stable. So they can be put in bags and then shipped around the world, right? You can't ship them like this because if you don't ferment them properly, they'll go rotten and mouldy, and they're useless. Right? So that fermentation process is very important because it not only gives the chocolate its flavour, but it also preserves the beans so that they can be shipped around the world. So that's where, and Galit's going to talk a little bit more how we make chocolate from those dried beans. So I want to turn now to this chocolate crisis. And these are headlines just from the last week, right? So this is from the Telegraph in Great Britain. You know, they're predicting that the price of chocolates is going to triple. This is from the Times of India, and they're predicting that the world's going to run out of chocolate by the 2nd of October 2020. So why are people saying this? And to understand why I talked about peak chocolate, or why there might be a crisis in cocoa supply, you need to understand something about the global market and the farmers who produce the cocoa beans. So if you think about the global market trends, over the past 20 years, we eat twice as much chocolate as we used to. That's largely because of the demand in Western countries for premium chocolates, right? So these are chocolates, so instead of having a Cadbury's dairy milk chocolate, which might contain 20% cocoa, we're eating more and more dark chocolates, which contain 60, 70, 80% cocoa, right? So each chocolate bar has 3 or 4 times as much cocoa beans in it as a Cadbury's dairy milk chocolate. So that's pushing up demand. The other big factor is that in the developing economies in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Asia, particularly China and India, people are starting to acquire a taste for chocolate. And these are not traditional markets for chocolate. And in fact, if you look at the consumption, in countries like Australia, we eat around about 6 kilograms of chocolate per head per year. The champions, I think, are the Germans and the British. They eat about 11 or 12. But people in India and China eat about 50 grams per head. So if they start eating as much chocolate as we do, that's going to lift the roof off the demand for chocolate. So these are the two big factors. And so chocolate companies are saying by 2020, so only 7 years, we're going to need another 25%, which is, at the moment, we produce about 4 million tonnes of cocoa beans. So that means we're going to need to find another 1 million tonnes of cocoa beans in 7 years. In addition to that, by 2020, all the major chocolate companies are saying, well, we're only going to sell certified cocoa beans. So organic or Rainforest Alliance or some sort of certified beans. They're not going to take beans from farmers that can't demonstrate where those beans have come from and how they've been produced. So that's putting a lot of pressure back onto the farmers to improve the way that they grow cocoa, to improve their farming practices. And this certification is driven by a couple of factors. One is that, when you go to the supermarket, you see, Rainforest Alliance or organic chocolates. A lot of consumers are going to buy those over regular uncertified chocolate. So there's a shift in preference. But in addition to that, it's part of a larger picture where supermarket chains in particular are very, very concerned about food safety. And so if there's an issue with the safety of any food product, whether it's chocolate or bean sprouts or beef or whatever, they want to be able to trace right back to the origin, to the farm that comes from. And farmers have to keep good records. Okay, so all of these things are putting lots of pressure on farmers, but actually they're not the farmer's problem. It's our problem. If you think about farmers, they're in a business. They can grow cocoa trees, but they can grow all sorts of other things as well. They don't have to grow cocoa beans. So all of these problems, if we make it too hard for farmers, they're going to say, well, I'm going to grow something that's easier to grow. And that's a big part of the problem that I'll show you. Oops. So here's the figures on consumption. Basically, you can see in Europe, this is cocoa beans. So you need to double or triple that to get chocolate. But you can see in Europe, they eat nearly 3 kilograms of cocoa beans, or 9 or 10 kilograms of chocolate per year. So this is chocolate production. And this is cocoa prices. And you can see the cocoa prices go up and down all over the place. What it would also show you is that the changes in cocoa price don't really have much of an impact on cocoa production. And this isn't surprising because farmers plant cocoa trees and their life is about 30 years. So it's not a crop that you can sow and pull out every year in response to prices. It's a long-term investment. So if a farmer puts in cocoa trees, they're there for 30 years, and their production's not really going to change in response to price. The other thing that this tells you, and at the moment chocolate prices are they're relatively high, they're almost up around $3,000 a tonne again. But what this shows you is that you can see that in a relatively short period of time, chocolate price or cocoa bean prices go from less than $2,000 a tonne to over $4,000 a tonne. And that's driven by speculators. Right? Cocoa beans are one of the most highly traded commodities on the world market. So you've got these factors where there's a lot of people speculating on cocoa bean prices based on the future of the cocoa market and what the rains were like in West Africa and so on. But that doesn't really affect the farmers. The farmers actually make no benefit out of those change in prices, really. So what are the big threats? Are we going to be able to meet this extra demand, or are we actually going to go backwards? Because there's many reasons why chocolate production may actually decline. And certainly over the last couple of years, it has been declining. I've mentioned declining profitability and competitiveness. There are other crops that may be more competitive. Market uncertainty, alternative crops, labour and land shortages, pests and diseases, climate and weather, and political instability. These are all things that farmers have to deal with day to day in their planning. So most of the cocoa is produced by smallholders. They produce 90%. Most smallholders are farmers who have about a hectare of land, a few hundred trees, and it's their main source of income. Right? This is Norman. He's a cocoa farmer in Papua New Guinea, and he used to be a mechanic. He discovered that growing cocoa was more profitable, and so he's become a very successful cocoa farmer. Most farmers, though, get relatively low yields, 300 to 400 kilograms of beans a year. Of that, they lose about 40% of their production to pests and diseases. And I mentioned the market uncertainty. The prices can double or halve. So the farmers really, it's very difficult for them to plan ahead. Do I put fertilizer on my crop this year in expectation that the prices will be high, or, what do I do? And remember, it takes 5 or 6 months from flowering through to harvest. So everything, these farmers aren't really used to planning in the long term. So it's really quite a complex decision process in how they manage their cocoa. I do a lot of work in Sulawesi. Sulawesi is here in Indonesia. So this is a corrected map. So Sulawesi is here in Indonesia, just north of Australia. And Sulawesi has a really interesting history because farmers only started growing cocoa there in the 1980s. Before that, it was essentially rainforest, and the Indonesian government decided that to move people out of really heavily populated parts of Indonesia to less populated parts. So one of the places that they moved people to was Sulawesi, this island Sulawesi. So the farmers cut down the rainforest, sold the timber, got a lot of money from selling the timber, and they planted cocoa. What happens on rainforest soils is that when you first cut down the timber, the soils are really rich. They've got lots and lots of organic matter. So you get this thing called forest rent, which means that you get soil fertility from the rainforest. And that lasts you about 10 or perhaps 20 years. And so the farmers for the, for the first 10 or 20 years were getting really high yields, 1.3, 1.5 tonnes per hectare. But over the past 30 years, those yields have gradually been declining as their soils become exhausted. So for 30 years, or for 20 years anyway, the farmers had it really easy. They didn't really have to do very much. They planted their cocoa trees and they harvested lots and lots of pods. But then as the soil fertility declined, they had to start making decisions. Are we going to use fertilisers to increase the yield? Are we going to cut our cocoa trees down and grow another crop that's more profitable? So there's all sorts of decisions that farmers had to make. In addition to that, farmers face all sorts of pressures that are beyond their control. Right? They can manage their cocoa, but there's all sorts of other pressures, social, environmental and economic changes. The markets aren't transparent. A farmer in Sulawesi doesn't know what a speculator in New York is going to do. So there's no transparency in the markets. Farmers are facing rising costs for fuel and fertiliser. They're short of labour, and I'll explain that in a minute. There's lots of pests and diseases that tend to become more severe. There's climate change, which is affecting the yields of cocoa and the areas where cocoa can be grown, and declining soil fertility. And the other thing to remember is that these are farmers who are very busy people. And growing cocoa may not be the most important thing that they do. Right? So they're not going to say, well, gee, my cocoa needs some attention, I'm going to drop everything else and go and look after it. They may have other things to do that are more important. Right? We think it's important because it's our chocolate, but for them, they've got lives to live, they've got families to look after. It may not necessarily be the most important thing for them. And the farmers are their ability to change is constrained by their past experience, lack of resources, lack of skills and lack of information. You know, good scientific information on how to improve their cocoa farming. That's one of the things that we do is go and work with farmers to help them to improve the way that they grow their cocoa. So what this means is that farmers tend not to invest very much money in their cocoa trees. Right? So their trees are getting old, the soil fertility is declining, they've got more and more pests and disease problems, they have a poor understanding of market, and they don't have a lot of support. So if you put all these things together, it means that farmers have very few incentives to grow cocoa. We want them to, but actually there's not a lot of incentive for them to want to grow cocoa. And there's lots of alternative crops: rice, coffee, rubber, oil palm. And if you look at the economics of these alternative crops, you can see that the yellow bar is the costs, the purple bars are the net returns. All right, so if you're a rice farmer, this column here is rice. If you're a rice farmer, you can see that your returns are tiny and your costs are a pretty high proportion of growing rice. Now, governments tend to want farmers to grow rice for food security. But what this information shows you is that actually growing rice is a poverty trap. Farmers are going to stay poor if they're forced to grow rice. And the food riots that happen around the world when the governments try and put up the price of rice show you what the farmers are up against. Right? They'll never really get a good income. Growing vegetables, so these are different types of vegetables, tomato, chilies, things like that. You can see that the potential to make a big profit is a lot higher, but also the costs are higher. There's a higher risk. This is cocoa. And you can see with cocoa that there's very few costs. And basically, most of your income is profit. And that's why cocoa is such an attractive crop for farmers. But you can see it's not the most attractive crop. This one here is jackfruit. All right, jackfruit. So if you're a farmer who grows a high value fruit, you're going to get a lot more profit. All right, so you can see that there's a lot going on for farmers when they're deciding what crops am I going to grow. You know, it comes down to the cost, to the risks, and the potential profits that they're likely to make. But cocoa is a pretty stable income. Now, labour's a problem, and this may seem strange because, you know, wherever I go, there's lots of people. So why is there a shortage of labour? Well, partly because farmers are getting older, as they are in Australia. Most importantly, because of illness. If you go to places like Papua New Guinea, most people have malaria, which means that you know, for long periods, they're sick in bed. They can't get out and work. If you go to Sulawesi, where Galit and I went last year, there's incredibly high rates of tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases. So people are sick a lot of the time. And if the farmers themselves aren't sick, their children, their partners are sick, and they're spending a lot of time taking them to the nearest health clinic, which may be a day or two away. So farmers actually spend a lot of time away from their farms, unable to do the sorts of management practices that we're suggesting. There's land tenure issues. You know, cocoa is a crop that grows for 30 years. So you put your trees in, you want to be sure that you've got tenure on that land for 30 years. You don't want some dispute to happen, which means that you're likely to lose your land. Right? It's a huge investment. And, you know, we're running out of rainforests. You know, there's a very simple reason that you know, we can't expand the plantings of cocoa because, you know, that means cutting down rainforests, and no one's really happy about doing that. Pests and diseases, these are the things that wreck cocoa. This is pod rot, this is called witch's broom, this is called frosty pod rot, this is vascular streak dieback, and this is cocoa pod borer. This is an insect that eats the pods away. These things are what cause farmers to lose around about 40% of their yields. In addition to that, many of the cocoa growing areas of the world are faced by political unrest, corruption, and very poor infrastructure. And the world's largest cocoa producing country, Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, 40% of the world's cocoa comes from Côte d'Ivoire. And they were just in the bizarre situation 2 years ago where they had two presidents because they had an election. The old president lost the election but didn't want to give up the presidency, so the new president said, well, I'm president, so they had two presidents, and basically that led to civil war. So in countries like West Africa or in Côte d'Ivoire, that's where you hear about child labour being an issue with cocoa farming. And the problem there is not that parents get their children to go out and work as slaves on the cocoa farm, but that because of civil unrest, orphans are taken by armies or vigilantes and put to work on cocoa plantations to earn money so that they can buy guns to fight their wars. So child labour isn't a fundamental part of producing cocoa, it's a consequence of the political unrest and the corruption that occurs in many cocoa growing countries. So the solution is not to stop eating chocolate, the solution is to fix the politics. So, with all of these problems, how do we meet global demand? Well, plant more trees. As I said, that's not really a viable option because we don't have a lot more land that's suitable for growing cocoa. High yielding genotypes, this is something I hear a lot about. You know, we can produce cocoa trees that produce 8 tonnes of beans per hectare. But if farmers are only getting 300 kilograms, what's the point? You know, the problem is getting farmers to improve what the yields that they're getting off their current genotypes rather than bringing in, you know, genetically modified cocoa or something that's got a higher potential yield. The problem's really, the answer is really intensifying the management of the existing cocoa. And as I said, you know, it's really quite easy to, by improving your management, to increase your cocoa yields on existing trees from 300 kilograms to well over a tonne per hectare, simply by improving the management. But to do that, farmers have to be motivated to want to put in the work to get that extra yield and extra income. Right? We've got the technology, but we've got to motivate the farmers to do it. Because investing money is a risk, and farmers are really quite risk averse. They want to be absolutely certain that they're going to get the benefits of their investment returned to them. So how do we produce sustainable cocoa? Well, one definition is that it's cocoa grown that's within a biologically diverse and environmentally sustainable agricultural system, being capable of providing lasting economic, social and environmental benefits. And this is really important, that it provides the cocoa growing communities with lasting economic, social and environmental benefits, because that's what sustainability is going to be based on. So how do we motivate farmers? There's a series of points here. But basically the answer comes from working with farmers. Not me coming from Sydney, going to cocoa farmers and saying, well, this is what you need to do, this and this. Because they're not going to listen to me. All right? What I need to do and what we do is we go to the farming communities and we ask them, well, what is it that you would like? And one of the things that we've discovered, as I pointed out before, one of the big problems is labour because of illness. So what we've been doing recently, we've started a program where when I go to Sulawesi or Papua New Guinea to train farmers on how to grow cocoa, I take my medical colleagues with me. And they talk to, particularly the mothers, about improving the health of their children. And so to me, this is a virtuous cycle, because people are going to be interested in their health once they've got a full tummy and a nice place to live. If they don't have a nice place to live and a full tummy, looking after their children's health is a secondary thing. So to me, the virtuous cycle is that by showing the farmers how to improve their cocoa production, they're getting an income. Once they have an income, they can improve their housing, they can improve their health, they can improve their education. So to me, the strategies for improving sustainable cocoa production are also the strategies for improving the livelihoods of cocoa farmers. We need to make their lives more valuable, and we need to improve their standard of living. And that way, they'll be interested in producing cocoa beans for us to eat as chocolate. Otherwise, they're not going to be interested. So this is where I'm going to hand over to Galit, because Galit's going to talk to you about what we actually do with the cocoa beans. And so Galit and I gave a talk at Sydney University about 18 months ago, I think. And then following that talk, Galit said, oh, look, I'd love to come and visit some cocoa farms with you. So last winter, Galit and I went to Sulawesi, and we spent some time working with or looking at cocoa farmers and seeing how it works. So I'll now hand over to Galit.
So I love chocolate. And I'm sure that's why all of you are here, because you are probably all chocolate lovers. And David talked about the cacao trees, about the fermentations of the beans. And I'm going to start my talk from the cocoa beans. So the cocoa beans look like almonds. And when you bite into them after the fermentation, they do have really bitter flavor and really strong chocolatey taste. And this photo was taken in Sulawesi, and one of the things that was quite amazing for me as a chocolate lover was walking just on the street, and you can see the cacao, all the cacao beans just dry out, and the smell of chocolate in the street is just unbelievable. You just walk there and smell chocolate. It's just really, really special experience. And I don't know whether you can see, I just took this particular photo because you can see the little toy, the little car of one of the kids that is near the chocolate, and that's something that was quite fascinating for me. You know, when you go and you see people that grow cacao trees in their backyard, and their kids' toys are near the cacao beans outside, so it's quite fascinating. So when you have the cacao beans, the next step will be to roast them. And while you roast the cacao beans, the flavor of the chocolate is intensified. It's actually release the chocolatey flavor that we all love so much. And inside those beans, we have the cocoa nibs, which are the center of the cocoa beans. And they look like that. And they're very, very chocolatey. So if you eat them, they're quite bitter, quite crumbly, because they're quite high with their fat content, and very, very chocolatey. You can give it a go later on and try them. So those nibs in the next step will be crushed and will be the base for our chocolate. So it's similar to peanut butter. So when you take your peanuts and crush them, they will release some of the fat, and the same thing happens with chocolate. So you're ending up with this really thick paste of chocolate, and that's what will be the chocolate later on for us. The second step will be, or the next step after that will be conching. So all those paste, all the paste of chocolate will be in a conch, and everything will rub, all the molecules and all the particles will rub one into the other, and that's actually give you small particles that have really nice cocoa butter coating under each particle of cocoa powder, and that's what gives you really nice, smooth, creamy texture to the chocolate. Just a little bit explanation of how we get cocoa butter and cocoa powder from the product. So if we take this really, really thick paste of chocolate and we press it, we will get two products. One of them will be the cocoa butter, and it will look like a really yellowish liquid. And when it's solidified, it will be very crumbly. So that's the cocoa butter. And the cocoa powder will end up as those really big rolls, and you crumble them and you have your cocoa powder. So that's how you get those two products. Just a little bit of explanation of how different chocolates are made and what they contain. So if you're looking at the dark chocolate, basically the dark chocolate will have the crushed cocoa nibs, just the crushed center of the cocoa beans with added sugar, and that's it. And this is why this is more superior and more expensive chocolate. The milk chocolate is made from the cocoa nibs that are represented by the cocoa powder and cocoa butter, sugar and milk powder usually. And the white chocolate is white because it doesn't contain the cocoa powder. So you have the cocoa butter, sugar and a little bit of milk powder. And this is why the flavor of white chocolate is more milky rather than the intense chocolatey flavor that we get in the higher percentage of cocoa solids chocolate. I always find it quite fascinating because one of my favorite moisturizer actually contain more chocolate than white chocolate. It is 100% cocoa butter. And when you look at that, in a white chocolate, you can have around 30%. So if you look at white chocolate and my moisturizer, you know, obviously my moisturizer is more chocolate than the white chocolate, which is quite funny. So when we buy chocolate, we can actually have two categories of chocolate, the compound chocolate and the couverture chocolate. So compound chocolate is the cheapest option that you usually get in the shop. And one of the reasons that it is much cheaper is because you have less of your chocolate in it. So some of them can contain around 12% of cocoa powder, and then the rest will be sugar, vegetable fat rather than the cocoa butter that is much more expensive, milk solid, and emulsifier is one of the things that you will find in most of the chocolate, and this is usually lecithin. Chocolate couverture is a chocolate that is made from the cacao beans and has only cocoa butter in it. You don't have the other type of fat. So when you eat good quality couverture, it's actually melt on your tongue. You have this cooling effect and you can really taste the chocolate flavor. And when you eat the inferior chocolate compound, a lot of time you're just going to end up with a film of fat on the roof of your mouth, because the cocoa butter have the ability to melt in really low temperature, but other fats like the palm that comes from palm oil will not give you the same cooling effect. It will not melt and it will just coat your mouth with a bit of a fatty feeling. Just wanted quickly just to talk about what does those percentage when you buy chocolate and it's 80% or 70%, and you can see how when you have more, when the percentage go higher, the numbers are showing off on your packaging. What they represent is how much of your cocoa beans you have in your chocolate. So the higher the percentage, you have more of the original bean. The rest is usually sugar. So if we look at 70% cocoa solids in this chocolate, 30% will be sugar. And just to give you a bit of an idea in terms of comparison, if you eat milk chocolate, quite a lot of the time in milk chocolate, 56%, around 56% is sugar in milk chocolate. That's why kids love milk chocolate. I did a chocolate workshop here with kids, and I asked every one of the kids to tell me what is their favorite chocolate. 95% of the kids say milk chocolate. I had one companion of dark chocolate lover there, and the rest were white chocolate because it is so sweet and it's just so moreish. But the higher the percentage, the stronger chocolate flavor you will have, and it's going to be a bit more bitter. You can get up to 100% cocoa solids in your chocolate, and that's going to be quite strong, bitter chocolate flavor. In terms of when you buy your really precious chocolate bar, what's the best way to look after it? Just such a precious product, and it just had such a long journey from the farm to our table. So the best way to look after your chocolate is actually store it in a cool place, cool and dry place. If it's really hot day like today, and you just do your shopping and you just walk outside for a bit too long, you will find out that your chocolate will change, and I'll talk about it in a second. Another thing is that chocolate have the ability to absorb odors, so you always need to store it away from things that have strong smells. So don't store it near a chopped onion. It won't do it any good. So storage is really, really important. And what's happened is when you have a hot day like that and you just walk around with your chocolate and have a long chat with your friends that you just met somewhere, your chocolate will actually start melting. And when it will re-solidify, it will have this white, powdery, like grey, powdery look to it. Did you ever come across chocolate like that? And then you think, oh, something sucks, it's just not good. Don't throw the chocolate. It's still all right, it's just out of temper. So if you ended up with chocolate that is out of temper, it will be a bit more crumbly, it will lose its snap, lose its gloss, but it's still okay, and you can use it for cooking. So when chocolate is tempered properly, you're actually going to have, what's happening is that the molecules sits really tightly together, and that's why the light bounces and you have this shine, and when you snap it you have this sound, which is really lovely. And I just want to go through steps of how you make molded chocolates, just to have appreciation of how much work and labor can go into this little small product. I always say sometimes it takes 2 days to make those chocolate and less than a minute to eat them. So you start with your mold, and it could be in different shapes, and you cover that with chocolate, melted chocolate that is tempered. And in the next step, you tip it over, so you can actually end up with those little shell of chocolate. And inside those really little small shells that sit inside your mold, you can pipe ganache. Ganache is a mixture of cream and chocolate, and I actually made some ganache for you to try. And then you just pipe your ganache, and you need to wait usually for, I would say overnight usually, for the ganache to set nicely. And you don't want to pipe the ganache too high, because in the next step, you're going to cover it again with chocolate. So quite intensive work go to these little precious things. After you cover the mold again, you just get rid of the top of the chocolate. You just leave it for another few hours, and then you can actually tip out your beautiful chocolates. And that's how we ended up having them in the shops. So looking at the journey from the tree to those really precious products, I think give us all a lot of appreciation to chocolates. And that's the story of chocolate, but quite a lot of, but it's one story of many. You know, each one of our food products has this beautiful journey and beautiful, just this beautiful hard work that just put into it. And I think that appreciating that as customers and consumers and enjoying the product is quite special. Thank you very much.